One day, you stop recognizing yourself. One day, you look at yourself, and something feels different. Not physically, internally. You notice. Your ambition faded. Your discipline weakened. Your focus disappeared. Your confidence changed. Your energy feels heavier. Your mind feels tired. And slowly, a terrifying question appears. What happened to me? Let's slow this down. Most people do not become lost overnight. They drift. Quietly. Slowly. Through repeated distractions, emotional exhaustion, comfort addiction, self-betrayal, weak habits, abandoned discipline, and eventually, the person in the mirror begins changing. The dangerous thing about identity decay is that most people do not notice it while it's happening. The change feels small daily. One more excuse. One more distraction. One more delayed dream. One more abandoned promise. But repetition compounds. And eventually, you wake up realizing you are no longer becoming the person you once promised yourself you would become. There are people listening to this right now who secretly feel disconnected from themselves, disconnected from their purpose, their ambition, their confidence, their discipline, their future. And deep down, they know something inside them changed. Most people think transformation only happens upward. Not true. People transform downward too. They slowly become more distracted, more emotionally tired, more inconsistent, more comfortable, more disconnected from themselves. And eventually, weakness becomes identity. There is something painful about realizing you slowly became someone you do not fully recognize anymore. Someone who procrastinates constantly, avoids discomfort, lacks focus,
wastes time, keeps abandoning themselves. That realization hurts deeply, because now you cannot blame ignorance anymore. Most people are not destroyed dramatically. They are destroyed quietly. Quietly through distraction, comfort, emotional escape, lack of discipline, repeated self-betrayal.
And eventually, the mirror reveals the consequences. The scariest thing about losing yourself is how normal it begins to feel. People become comfortable wasting time, lacking purpose, staying distracted, becoming emotionally numb, until dysfunction becomes personality. There are people listening to this right now who miss the old version of themselves, the version that had ambition, had energy, had discipline, believed in bigger things, wanted more from life. But years of comfort, distraction, emotional exhaustion, self-sabotage changed them slowly. This audiobook is not about motivation. It is about identity, about becoming conscious of who you are becoming, what habits are shaping you, what patterns are changing you, what your future is slowly turning into. Because identity is never standing still. Every habit changes you slightly. Every routine changes you slightly. Every repeated behavior reshapes identity slowly. That means you are becoming someone right now, whether intentionally or unconsciously. Most people think, I still have time. And maybe they do. But time means nothing if the patterns remain the same. Because repeated behavior creates repeated identity. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please wake up, begging you to stop wasting your life, to rebuild your discipline, to stop escaping emotionally, to become intentional again, because your future depends on who you are becoming daily. Most people are addicted to distraction because distraction protects them from self-confrontation. Silence forces people to notice their habits, their inconsistency, their wasted potential, their emotional exhaustion. And many people spend their entire lives trying to avoid that confrontation. The mirror never lies. Eventually, your habits appear in your eyes, in your posture, in your energy, in your confidence, in your mindset. Because repeated behavior shapes identity externally too. There is something emotionally terrifying about becoming someone you once promised yourself you would never become. Someone tired, distracted, emotionally weak, comfortable with mediocrity, disconnected from purpose. That realization creates pain. But pain creates awakening too. Most people are not failing because they lack potential. They are failing because they are slowly becoming weaker versions of themselves. And weak identity creates weak future. The strongest people interrupt identity decay early, before comfort becomes personality, distraction becomes lifestyle, emotional exhaustion becomes identity. That awareness changes destiny. You cannot become powerful while continuously feeding weakness. Impossible. Because every repeated habit trains identity. Every time you procrastinate, avoid discomfort, surrender to distraction, abandon discipline, you strengthen the weaker version of yourself slightly. And eventually, that weaker version begins taking over completely. Most people do not realize they are changing until life forces them to notice. Forces them to notice through regret, emotional emptiness, lack of purpose, lost confidence, wasted years. And by then, they barely recognize themselves internally. The strongest transformations happen when people finally confront the mirror honestly. Honestly enough to ask, who am I becoming? What habits are shaping me? Why do I feel disconnected from myself? What happened to the person I wanted to become? That honesty creates awakening. Every day, you are becoming someone. Not someday. Now. Through habits, routines, emotional responses, standards, repeated behavior. That process never pauses. Most people wait too long to wake up mentally, too long to rebuild discipline, protect their future, confront weak habits, stop repeating self-destruction. And eventually, time exposes the consequences of unconscious living. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, consistency, emotional maturity, intentional living. But weak habits keep delaying access to that identity. This audiobook is about waking up, confronting yourself honestly, rebuilding identity, becoming intentional again, becoming someone you respect. Because the person in the mirror is changing, whether you notice it or not. One day, you will either look in the mirror with pride, or you will grieve the version of yourself you slowly abandoned. Because identity is built daily, not suddenly. There is one final truth before this audiobook begins. You do not wake up one day and magically become someone else. You become someone else through repeated habits, repeated compromises, repeated self-betrayal, repeated emotional escape. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to keep becoming someone I no longer recognize. Chapter 1. The slow change nobody notices. Nobody wakes up one morning completely lost. It happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. That is what makes it dangerous. Let's slow this down. There are people listening to this right now who still look normal externally. They still smile, work, talk, function, exist. But internally, something changed. Their fire feels weaker. Their discipline feels weaker. Their confidence feels weaker. Their ambition feels tired. And deep down, they know they are not becoming who they were meant to become anymore. Identity rarely collapses dramatically. It fades through repeated distractions, emotional exhaustion, comfort addiction, weak habits, self-betrayal, unconscious living. And because the change happens slowly, most people never notice it while it's happening. That is the terrifying thing about identity decay. It feels normal while it's destroying you. One more excuse feels harmless. One more distraction feels harmless. One more delayed dream feels harmless. But repetition compounds, and eventually, your habits reshape you completely. Every repeated behavior changes identity slightly. Every day you procrastinate, avoid discomfort, abandon discipline, waste time, escape emotionally. You become a slightly weaker version of yourself. And every day you stay focused, remain disciplined, continue anyway, protect your future. You become stronger. That repetition shapes destiny. Most people underestimate how much small habits affect identity. Because the damage is not immediate. That is why people stay trapped. They think, it's just one day. It's just one distraction. I'll change later. But repeated compromise changes personality. The slowest changes are often the most dangerous changes, because gradual decline is difficult to notice. You slowly lose focus, lose discipline, lose confidence, lose ambition, lose emotional resilience, until eventually you barely recognize yourself internally. There are people listening to this right now who remember an older version of themselves, a version that dreamed bigger, believed more, worked harder, had more discipline, had stronger energy. But life happened. Comfort happened. Distraction happened. Emotional exhaustion happened. And slowly, the mirror began changing. Most people do not realize they are becoming emotionally numb. Numb to wasted time, lack of discipline, mediocrity, distraction, inconsistency. Because repeated dysfunction becomes familiar, and familiar dysfunction begins feeling normal. That is how people lose themselves. Not suddenly, gradually.
Through unconscious repetition. The strongest people pay attention to subtle changes. Subtle changes in focus, habits, mindset, emotional state, discipline. Because they understand small decline eventually creates major destruction. There is something painful about realizing you slowly abandoned yourself. Not all at once, piece by piece. You abandoned your standards, your discipline, your focus, your ambition, your future. And eventually, the consequences appeared in the mirror. Most people think they are standing still, but identity never stands still. You are always becoming someone, every day, through habits, routines,
emotional responses, repeated behaviors. That process never pauses. Most people wait until life becomes painful before they finally pay attention to themselves, before they notice the emotional exhaustion, the lack of purpose, the loss of confidence, the disconnection from identity. But the signs existed long before the collapse. Every distraction costs something. This matters deeply, because distraction steals focus, momentum, discipline, self-awareness, and repeated distraction weakens identity slowly. Most people are overstimulated, but underdeveloped internally. Constant noise, scrolling, entertainment, emotional escape leaves very little room for reflection, discipline, intentional growth, self-awareness. And unconscious living creates unconscious suffering. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please wake up. Begging you to stop wasting time, to rebuild your discipline, to stop escaping emotionally, to become intentional again. Because your future depends on what you repeatedly practice. The scariest thing about identity decay is how easy it becomes to normalize weakness. People normalize procrastination, distraction, emotional inconsistency, comfort addiction, lack of purpose, until weakness becomes lifestyle. You become what you repeatedly tolerate. If you tolerate laziness, excuses, distraction, emotional weakness, your identity eventually reflects those things. But if you tolerate discipline, focus, responsibility, intentional living, your future transforms differently. Most people are not destroyed by one catastrophic event. They are destroyed by repeated compromises, repeated self-betrayal, repeated emotional escape. And over time, those patterns reshape identity completely. The strongest people become conscious of who they are becoming, conscious of what habits are changing them, what environments are influencing them, what distractions are weakening them. Because awareness creates control. Most people do not realize their environment is reshaping them too. Environment affects mindset, focus, standards, discipline, emotional energy. That is why intentional environments matter deeply.
Every repeated action teaches the brain something. Every habit says, "This is who we are." That means your routines are training your identity daily. There is something emotionally exhausting about secretly knowing you are capable of more, but watching yourself slowly become less. Less disciplined, focused, intentional, emotionally strong. That internal conflict destroys peace. Most people are not lacking potential, they are lacking intentionality. Because potential without discipline eventually fades. The strongest transformations happen when people finally become uncomfortable with who they are becoming. Uncomfortable enough to change habits, to rebuild routines, to stop wasting time, to confront themselves honestly. That discomfort creates awakening. The mirror reflects patterns, not intentions, not dreams. Patterns. Your habits, discipline, routines, emotional behavior eventually appear externally. Most people spend years trying to change outcomes without changing identity. Impossible. Because outcomes follow repeated behavior. Another truth. You cannot become powerful while unconsciously feeding weakness daily. Every repeated act of procrastination, distraction, avoidance, emotional escape strengthens the weaker version of you slightly, and eventually, that weaker version takes control completely. The strongest people interrupt decline early, before comfort becomes identity, distraction becomes lifestyle, emotional exhaustion becomes personality. That awareness changes destiny. Every disciplined action matters. Every time you focus anyway, continue anyway, resist distraction anyway, protect your future anyway, you rebuild identity slightly. That repetition creates transformation. Most people wait too long to confront the mirror honestly. Too long to ask, who am I becoming? What habits are changing me? Why do I feel disconnected from myself? When did I stop fighting for my future? And eventually, time exposes the consequences of unconscious living. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, intentionality, emotional maturity, repeated self-respect. But weak habits keep delaying access to that identity. One day, you will either thank yourself for waking up early, or you will realize you slowly became someone you never intended to become. Because identity does not collapse overnight. It changes quietly. There is one final truth in this chapter. The slow change nobody notices is still changing everything. Quietly, daily, repeatedly. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally became honest enough to ask, what am I slowly becoming? Chapter 2. Comfort changed you quietly. Most people think comfort is harmless. It isn't. Comfort changes people. Quietly. Slowly. Psychologically, because comfort does not always look dangerous. Sometimes comfort looks like endless scrolling, avoiding difficult work, staying distracted, emotional escape, procrastination, living without urgency. And over time, those repeated behaviors reshape identity completely. Let's slow this down. There are people listening to this right now who did not suddenly become weaker. They became comfortable. Comfortable with delaying dreams, abandoning discipline, wasting time, lacking focus, emotionally escaping life. And eventually, comfort became personality. The dangerous thing about comfort is that it rarely feels destructive in the moment. Comfort feels safe, easy, familiar, emotionally relieving. That is why so many people get trapped inside it. Most people think destruction feels painful immediately. Not true. Some destruction feels peaceful while it's ruining you. That is the hidden danger of comfort. Every time you choose comfort over growth, you train yourself to avoid discomfort, to escape pressure, to delay transformation, to weaken emotional resilience. And repeated avoidance reshapes identity slowly. The strongest people understand comfort is addictive, because comfort protects people from self-confrontation, responsibility, difficult growth, emotional honesty, and many people spend years hiding inside that emotional safety. There is something painful about realizing you slowly traded your ambition for comfort, traded focus for distraction, discipline for ease, growth for entertainment, intentionality for emotional escape. And eventually, the person in the mirror began changing. Most people do not notice the damage immediately, because comfort destroys people gradually. One comfortable day feels harmless, but comfortable years create regret. The human mind naturally seeks relief. That is why weak habits become addictive. Because distraction relieves pressure. Procrastination relieves discomfort. Emotional escape relieves responsibility. But temporary relief often creates long-term suffering. There are people listening to this right now who secretly miss the version of themselves that used to fight harder. The version that dreamed bigger, stayed disciplined longer, had more energy, wanted more from life. But comfort slowly weakened that identity. Comfort lowers standards quietly. This matters deeply, because once standards weaken, discipline weakens too. And when discipline weakens, identity begins changing. Most people do not become emotionally weak overnight. They become emotionally soft through repetition. Repeated avoidance, distraction, comfort, emotional escape. That repetition conditions the mind. The strongest people become uncomfortable with comfort, not because they hate peace, but because they understand comfort can quietly destroy ambition. There is something terrifying about becoming someone who no longer pushes themselves anymore. Someone who settles easily, avoids discomfort, lacks urgency, accepts mediocrity, stops fighting for growth. That realization creates emotional pain. Most people do not realize. Comfort changes the nervous system too. Comfort trains the mind to avoid difficulty, to seek instant pleasure, to resist pressure, to escape discomfort. And eventually, discomfort feels unbearable. That is why disciplined people feel different emotionally, because discipline trains resilience. Discipline teaches emotional control, focus, consistency, delayed gratification. Those habits create mental strength. Comfort makes people passive. Passive people stop pursuing growth, protecting time, rebuilding themselves, confronting weakness, and passive living creates passive identity. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please stop choosing comfort over your future, begging you to rebuild discipline, to wake up mentally, to stop escaping emotionally, to become intentional again. Because your future depends on what you repeatedly tolerate.
Every comfortable excuse changes you slightly. Every later, tomorrow, next week, one more distraction strengthens the weaker version of you slightly. That repetition creates identity. Most people are not trapped by lack of opportunity. They are trapped by comfortable patterns. Patterns of procrastination, distraction, emotional escape, weak routines, lack of urgency, and repeated patterns become personality. The strongest transformations happen when people finally become tired of comfort, tired of wasting years, abandoning themselves, feeling emotionally disconnected, becoming weaker versions of themselves. That frustration creates awakening. Comfort often disguises itself as rest, but there is a difference between healthy recovery and emotional avoidance. One restores you, the other weakens you slowly. Most people are overstimulated, but emotionally underdeveloped. Constant entertainment, scrolling, distraction, emotional escape leaves little room for discipline, reflection, intentional growth.
Self-awareness and unconscious living reshapes identity unconsciously. The strongest people protect themselves from comfort addiction, protecting focus, discipline, routines, emotional resilience, standards. Because standards determine identity. You become what you repeatedly practice. If you repeatedly practice avoidance, comfort, emotional escape, procrastination, you become emotionally weaker. But if you repeatedly practice discipline, focus, self-awareness, and unconscious living reshapes identity unconsciously. The strongest people protect themselves from comfort addiction, protecting focus, discipline, routines, emotional resilience, standards. Because standards determine identity. You become what you repeatedly practice. If you repeatedly practice avoidance, comfort, emotional escape, procrastination, you become emotionally weaker. But if you repeatedly practice discipline, focus, intentionality, consistency, you become emotionally stronger. That repetition changes destiny. There is something emotionally exhausting about secretly knowing you are capable of more while continuously choosing less. Less effort, focus, discipline, urgency. That internal conflict destroys peace. Comfort makes people forget who they used to be. Forget their ambition, their hunger, their vision,
their standards, and eventually they stop recognizing themselves internally. Most people think
They can stay comfortable temporarily and become strong later. But repeated comfort weakens identity deeply, because identity adapts to repetition. Every day, you are either strengthening discipline or strengthening comfort addiction. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. The strongest people intentionally do difficult things. Not because difficulty is enjoyable, but because difficulty builds resilience. Emotional strength, confidence, self-respect. That repetition creates powerful identity. You cannot become powerful while continuously protecting weakness. Weakness must be confronted, not comforted. Most people wait too long to realize comfort was quietly changing them. Changing their mindset, their energy, their standards, their emotional resilience, their future. And eventually, the mirror reflects the consequences. Every act of discipline interrupts comfort slightly. Every time you continue anyway, focus anyway, wake up anyway, resist distraction anyway, you weaken the comfortable version of yourself. That repetition rebuilds identity. Most people do not lose themselves dramatically. They lose themselves through comfort. Comfort that delays urgency, weakens standards, destroys focus, numbs ambition. That slow destruction becomes identity. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, discomfort, intentionality, emotional maturity. But comfort keeps delaying access to that identity. One day, you will either thank yourself for confronting comfort early, or you will realize comfort quietly changed you into someone you never intended to become. Because comfort never stays harmless. It reshapes identity. There is one final truth in this chapter. Comfort changed you quietly, not suddenly, not dramatically. Quietly through distraction, procrastination, emotional escape, repeated avoidance. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to let comfort decide who I become anymore. Chapter 3. You started abandoning yourself. Most people think self-abandonment is dramatic. It isn't. Self-abandonment happens quietly. It happens every time you ignore your potential, you betray your standards, you abandon discipline, you stop protecting your future, you become comfortable with less. And eventually, the person in the mirror begins changing. Let's slow this down. There are people listening to this right now who are carrying a strange kind of sadness. Not because life completely destroyed them, but because deep down, they know they stopped showing up for themselves. They stopped trying fully, believing deeply, fighting consistently, protecting their future intentionally. And slowly, that abandonment changed their identity. You do not lose yourself in one moment. You lose yourself through repeated neglect. Neglect of your discipline, your mental health, your ambition, your standards, your emotional well-being. That repeated neglect reshapes identity slowly. Most people are waiting for external rescue, but the painful truth is, the person who abandoned you the most was often you. You abandoned your goals, your routines, your self-respect, your consistency, your future. Not once. Repeatedly. Every broken promise weakens self-trust. Every time you say, I'll start tomorrow. This time will be different. I'll become disciplined. and then repeat the same behaviors, your mind notices, and eventually your own mind stops believing you. That is how self-respect begins collapsing internally, quietly, through repeated self-betrayal. There is something emotionally painful about becoming unreliable to yourself, because deep down, you remember the version of you that once believed bigger things were possible. Most people do not realize self-abandonment creates emotional exhaustion.
Because carrying unrealized potential is heavy. Very heavy. Especially when you know you are capable of more. Every time you abandon yourself, you strengthen the weaker version of yourself slightly. The version that procrastinates, escapes emotionally, lacks discipline, avoids discomfort, wastes time, and repeated weakness becomes identity. Most people are not emotionally broken permanently. They are emotionally disconnected from themselves, disconnected from purpose, discipline, intentional living, self-respect. That disconnection creates emptiness. You cannot keep abandoning yourself and expect confidence to survive. Impossible. Because confidence requires evidence. Evidence that you can trust yourself. You can stay disciplined. You can protect your future. You can keep promises to yourself. That evidence creates self-respect. The strongest people rebuild self-trust intentionally, not emotionally, intentionally, through routines, discipline, consistency, repeated self-respect.
That repetition restores identity slowly. Most people think they need motivation, but often what they truly need is reconnection. Reconnection with their standards, their ambition, their discipline, their future self, because disconnected people slowly drift emotionally. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please stop abandoning me, begging you to wake up mentally, to stop wasting your life, to become disciplined again, to protect your future intentionally, because your future depends on how you treat yourself daily. Self-abandonment often disguises itself as comfort. People say, I'm tired, I'll do it later, I need a break. And sometimes that is true, but repeated avoidance eventually becomes identity. Most people do not realize they slowly lowered their standards. Lowered standards around focus, discipline, habits, emotional control, self-respect,
and weak standards create weak identity. Every repeated act of self-neglect changes you slightly. Every wasted day, broken promise, emotional escape, abandoned routine reshapes identity slowly. That repetition creates the person in the mirror. The strongest people stop normalizing self-betrayal. They stop accepting inconsistency, laziness, distraction, emotional weakness, because repeated weakness becomes personality. There is something terrifying about waking up one day and realizing you slowly became someone who no longer fights for themselves. Someone emotionally tired, distracted, passive, disconnected, comfortable with less. That realization creates pain, but pain creates awakening too. Most people abandon themselves through distraction. Constant scrolling, entertainment, emotional escape, avoidance keeps people disconnected from reflection, intentionality, growth, discipline. And unconscious distraction creates unconscious identity. You become emotionally weaker
every time you repeatedly avoid discomfort. Because avoidance trains fragility, and fragility weakens identity. The strongest people practice self-respect daily, not through words, through behavior. Behavior like waking up intentionally, protecting focus, staying disciplined, keeping promises, rebuilding routines. That repetition creates emotional strength. Most people secretly know they are abandoning themselves. They feel it in their energy, in their habits, in their confidence, in their emotional state.
But awareness without action changes nothing. Every act of discipline is an act of self-respect. Every time you continue anyway, focus anyway, resist distraction anyway, protect your future anyway, you rebuild trust with yourself slightly. That repetition restores identity. The strongest transformations happen when people finally become tired of disappointing themselves, tired of restarting, procrastinating, wasting years becoming weaker versions of themselves. That frustration creates a weakening. Most people are emotionally exhausted because they keep carrying the weight of neglected potential, the weight of unfinished dreams, abandoned routines, broken promises, wasted time. That emotional burden becomes heavy over time. You cannot heal your identity while continuously betraying yourself. Healing requires alignment. Alignment between words, habits, standards, discipline. That alignment creates peace internally. The strongest people become reliable to themselves again. Reliable enough to stay disciplined, to continue under pressure, to protect their future, to stop emotionally escaping life. That reliability rebuilds confidence deeply. Most people wait too long to reconnect with themselves again, too long to rebuild discipline, confront weak habits, stop wasting time, protect their future intentionally. And eventually, the mirror reflects years of neglect. There is something emotionally powerful about finally deciding, I will stop abandoning myself. That decision changes identity, because now you stop living unconsciously and begin rebuilding intentionally. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, consistency, emotional maturity, intentional action. But self-abandonment keeps delaying access to that identity. Every day, you are either reconnecting with yourself or drifting further away from yourself. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. Most people think they lost themselves completely. Not true. Most people simply stopped choosing themselves consistently. And repeated neglect created emotional distance. One day, you will either thank yourself for rebuilding self-respect, or you will realize you slowly abandoned the person you were supposed to become. Because identity does not disappear suddenly. It fades through neglect. There is one final truth in this chapter. You started abandoning yourself quietly, through broken promises, weak habits, emotional escape, repeated self-betrayal. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves
are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to keep betraying the person I still have the potential to become.
Chapter 4. The Habits Reshaping Your Identity. Most people think habits are small. They are wrong. Your habits are building your mindset, your emotional state, your confidence, your discipline, your future, your identity. Every repeated behavior is shaping the person in the mirror, whether you notice it or not. Let's slow this down. There are people listening to this right now who are not suffering from one major failure. They are suffering from repeated patterns. Patterns like procrastination, distraction, emotional escape, inconsistency, lack of discipline, weak routines. And over time, those patterns quietly reshaped who they became. Identity is not created through intentions. Identity is created through repetition. Repeated thoughts,
behaviors, routines, emotional responses. That repetition becomes personality. Most people underestimate how much their daily routines affect their emotional life, because habits influence focus, energy, confidence, emotional resilience, self-respect. That is why weak habits create weak emotional states. Every habit teaches your brain something. Every repeated behavior says, "This is who we are." That means when you repeatedly procrastinate, avoid discomfort, waste time, abandon discipline, you train yourself to become weaker emotionally. And when you repeatedly stay focused, remain disciplined, protect your routines, continue anyway, you train yourself to become stronger. That repetition changes identity. Most people are living on autopilot habits,
autopilot distractions, autopilot emotional responses, and unconscious repetition creates unconscious identity. The dangerous thing about habits is that they compound quietly. One weak decision feels harmless, but repeated weak decisions create weak identity. That is how people slowly become emotionally tired, mentally distracted, inconsistent, disconnected from themselves. Not suddenly, gradually, through repetition. There is something emotionally painful about realizing you trained yourself to become weaker.
Trained yourself through comfort, distraction, procrastination, emotional avoidance. That realization hurts deeply, because now you must confront your patterns honestly. Most people want transformation, while protecting the habits destroying transformation. Impossible, because repeated behavior always wins eventually. Every habit is shaping your future self. Every morning routine, emotional reaction, distraction, decision, repeated behavior is building someone. The question is, who are you becoming? Most people think they can separate habits from identity. They cannot, because habits eventually become personality. The way you think, move, react, focus, live, is shaped through repetition. There are people listening to this right now who secretly know their habits are destroying their confidence, because every day they procrastinate, waste time, abandon routines, avoid discomfort, and deep down, their mind notices every act of self-betrayal. That is why self-respect begins collapsing quietly, because repeated inconsistency weakens trust internally, and eventually, people stop believing in themselves completely. Confidence is not built through motivation. Confidence is built through evidence. Evidence that you can stay disciplined,
You can remain consistent. You can control yourself. You can continue under pressure. That evidence comes from habits.
The strongest people become obsessed with intentional routines because they understand routines protect identity, protect discipline, emotional stability, focus, momentum, self-respect. That structure creates powerful people. Most people are emotionally reacting to life constantly, reacting to notifications, impulses, entertainment, temporary emotions, and emotionally reactive living destroys intentional identity. The strongest people intentionally design their routines, not perfectly, intentionally, because intentional routines create intentional futures. You become what you repeatedly practice. If you repeatedly practice distraction, emotional escape, procrastination, inconsistency, you become emotionally weaker. But if you repeatedly practice discipline, focus, emotional control, consistency, you become emotionally stronger. That repetition changes destiny. Most people are one disciplined routine away from becoming emotionally different people. Different mentally, emotionally, spiritually. But routines require consistency, and consistency requires standards. There is something terrifying about realizing your habits are slowly replacing the person you used to be. Replacing ambition, focus, discipline, emotional resilience with distraction, emotional exhaustion, passiveness, comfort addiction. That realization creates urgency. The strongest people stop normalizing weak habits. They stop saying, "It's not a big deal. I'll fix it later. Everybody does it." Because repeated weakness becomes identity eventually.
Every habit either builds freedom or builds limitation. That process never pauses. Every repeated action shapes identity. Most people fail privately before they fail publicly. They fail internally, through weak routines, weak standards, emotional inconsistency, lack of discipline. And eventually, external life reflects internal patterns. The strongest transformations happen quietly through routines, discipline, emotional control, repeated self-respect. That repetition rebuilds identity slowly. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please rebuild your habits, begging you to stop wasting time,
To stop escaping emotionally, to protect your routines, to become intentional again. Because your future depends on what you repeatedly practice. Most people think they need more motivation, but often they simply need stronger systems. Systems that protect focus, discipline, routines, emotional stability. That structure changes lives. The strongest people remove unnecessary distractions, weak environments, emotional chaos, inconsistent routines, because clarity protects identity. Every disciplined habit rebuilds self-respect slightly. Every time you wake up intentionally, continue anyway, focus anyway, resist distraction anyway,
You rebuild trust with yourself slightly. That repetition restores confidence. Most people wait too long to realize their habits changed them completely, changed their energy, their confidence, their emotional state, their future. And eventually, the mirror reflects years of unconscious repetition.
You cannot become powerful while practicing weakness daily. Impossible. Because repeated behavior creates repeated identity. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind disciplined routines, emotional maturity, intentional habits, consistency. But weak patterns keep delaying access to that identity. Every day,
You are rehearsing someone. Rehearsing discipline or distraction, intentionality or emotional escape, growth or stagnation. That process never pauses. Most people are not trapped permanently. They are simply trapped inside repeated behaviors, and repeated behaviors become emotional prisons. There is something emotionally powerful about finally deciding, I will rebuild my habits before my habits destroy me. That decision changes identity, because now you stop living unconsciously and begin rebuilding intentionally. One day, you will either thank yourself for rebuilding your routines, or you will realize your habits slowly turned you into someone you no longer recognize. Because habits never stay small. They become identity. There is one final truth in this chapter. The habits reshaping your identity are shaping your future too. Quietly, daily, repeatedly. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to keep practicing the version of myself that is destroying my future.
Chapter 5. You became emotionally tired. There is a kind of tiredness sleep cannot fix. A tiredness deeper than the body. A tiredness in the mind, the spirit, the emotions, the identity. And many people are carrying it silently. Let's slow this down. There are people listening to this right now who are not physically exhausted. They are emotionally exhausted. Exhausted from overthinking, self-betrayal, emotional chaos, lack of direction, repeating the same cycles, becoming someone they no longer recognize. And deep down, they feel disconnected from themselves. Emotional exhaustion rarely happens suddenly. It builds slowly, through repeated stress, emotional suppression, unresolved disappointment, lack of discipline, unconscious living. And eventually, your energy changes completely. Most people think they are lazy, but sometimes they are emotionally drained from carrying a life that no longer feels aligned with who they want to become. That disconnect creates heaviness. There is something exhausting about waking up every day and secretly knowing you are wasting your potential. That internal conflict drains emotional energy deeply. Most people are fighting invisible battles internally. Battles with self-doubt, emotional numbness, lack of purpose, disappointment, regret, distraction addiction. And because those battles are invisible, nobody notices how tired they truly are. Emotional exhaustion changes identity slowly. It changes your focus, your confidence, your posture, your energy, your motivation. And eventually, the mirror begins reflecting emotional fatigue externally too. The dangerous thing about emotional exhaustion is that people begin accepting it as normal. They normalize waking up tired, living distracted, lacking purpose, feeling emotionally numb, surviving instead of living intentionally. And normalized exhaustion becomes identity.
Most people are not exhausted from doing too much. They are exhausted from carrying unrealized potential, repeating self-destruction, abandoning themselves repeatedly, living disconnected from purpose. That emotional weight becomes heavy over time. There is something painful about remembering the version of yourself that once felt alive, the version that dreamed bigger, had more energy,
Felt more hopeful, believed more deeply, fought harder. But years of comfort, emotional escape, disappointment, distraction, changed that identity slowly. The strongest people protect their emotional energy intentionally, because energy affects discipline, focus, consistency, emotional resilience, identity. That is why intentional living matters deeply. Most people are overstimulated, but emotionally empty. Constant noise, scrolling, entertainment, distraction leaves very little room for peace, reflection, emotional healing, intentional growth. Repeated self-respect, but exhaustion keeps delaying access to that identity. Every day, you are either draining yourself or rebuilding yourself. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. Most people do not need to become someone completely different. They simply need to reconnect with discipline, purpose, focus, emotional honesty. That reconnection changes everything. One day, you will either thank yourself for rebuilding your emotional life, or you will realize you slowly became emotionally exhausted from carrying a version of life that no longer reflected who you truly wanted to become. Because emotional exhaustion rarely happens suddenly. It builds quietly. There is one final truth in this chapter. You became emotionally tired, not only because life was difficult, but because you slowly disconnected from your purpose, your discipline, your future, your identity. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to keep surviving emotionally inside a life that is destroying who I am becoming. Chapter 6. Distraction is replacing your life. Most people think distraction is harmless. It isn't. Distraction is not only stealing time, it is replacing identity, replacing focus, discipline, ambition, emotional depth, intentional living. And the terrifying part? Most people do not even realize it is happening. Let's slow this down. There are people listening to this right now who no longer know how to be fully present. Their attention is constantly fragmented, pulled in different directions by notifications, entertainment, scrolling, noise, overstimulation. And over time, that constant distraction changed them psychologically. The modern world profits from your distraction, because distracted people consume more, think less, reflect less, question less, build less, become less intentional. And unconscious living creates unconscious identity. Most people think they are relaxing, but often they are escaping themselves. Escaping discomfort, responsibility, emotional truth,
self-confrontation, purpose. And repeated escape becomes lifestyle.
There is something emotionally dangerous about never sitting alone with your own thoughts anymore. Because silence reveals things distraction tries to hide. Silence reveals wasted potential, emotional exhaustion, lack of discipline, self-betrayal, identity decay. And many people spend their entire lives avoiding that confrontation. Distraction feels harmless because it relieves pressure temporarily. Scrolling relieves boredom. Entertainment relieves stress. Noise relieves self-awareness. But temporary relief often creates long-term emptiness. Every distraction costs something. This matters deeply, because distraction steals focus, creativity, discipline, emotional depth, intentionality, and eventually, distraction begins replacing your entire life. Most people no longer control their attention. Their attention is controlled by algorithms, impulses, dopamine, emotional reactions.
Endless stimulation and controlled attention creates controlled identity. The strongest people protect their attention aggressively because attention shapes habits, thoughts, emotions, discipline, identity. Where attention goes, identity follows. There are people listening to this right now who secretly feel mentally scattered constantly. Scattered because they cannot focus deeply. They cannot stay present. They cannot sit with silence. They cannot escape overstimulation. And deep down, they know something inside them changed. Distraction weakens emotional resilience because distraction trains the brain to avoid stillness. And people who cannot sit still internally often struggle to confront themselves honestly. That is why intentional silence feels uncomfortable initially.
Because silence forces awareness. Awareness of habits, emotional patterns, wasted time, neglected potential. And awareness creates responsibility. Most people are overstimulated, but spiritually empty. Constant scrolling, entertainment, noise, emotional escape leaves little room for discipline, reflection, growth, intentional living. And overstimulation weakens identity slowly. There is something emotionally painful about realizing you slowly lost your ability to focus deeply, lost your ability to think clearly, to stay disciplined, to remain present, to protect your attention. That realization creates urgency.
Every distraction trains the brain slightly. Every time you interrupt focus, avoid stillness, seek instant stimulation, escape boredom, you strengthen distraction addiction slightly. That repetition changes identity. Most people do not realize their environment is programming them psychologically. Programming shorter attention spans, emotional reactivity, instant gratification, constant stimulation dependence. And unconscious programming creates unconscious identity. The strongest people intentionally disconnect sometimes. Disconnect from noise, distraction, overstimulation, emotional chaos. Because clarity requires space, and space creates awareness. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally,
please protect your attention, begging you to stop wasting your mind, to stop emotionally escaping, to rebuild focus, to become intentional again. Because your future depends on what controls your attention daily. Most people are not mentally weak naturally.
They became mentally scattered through repeated distraction. Repeated scrolling, multitasking, emotional escape, overstimulation. That repetition weakens focus deeply. The strongest version of you requires focus, requires presence, discipline, intentional thinking, emotional clarity. But distraction keeps interrupting access to that identity. There is something terrifying about becoming someone who can no longer sit quietly without stimulation. Because now, silence feels unbearable. And unbearable silence often reveals emotional disconnection. Most people are using distraction as emotional anesthesia. To numb stress, disappointment, loneliness, uncertainty, lack of purpose. But numbing emotions does not heal emotions. It delays confrontation. Distraction slowly disconnects people from reality, from purpose, discipline, reflection, meaningful growth, intentional living. And disconnected people slowly drift through life unconsciously. Most people are consuming constantly, but building very little internally. Consuming entertainment, noise, information, stimulation, but not building discipline, focus, emotional strength, self-awareness. That imbalance weakens identity deeply. The strongest people become intentional about what they watch, what they consume, what controls their attention, what environments influence them. Because intentional attention creates intentional identity. Every focused moment rebuilds identity slightly. Every time you stay present, resist distraction, think deeply, protect your attention, you rebuild mental strength slightly. That repetition creates clarity. Most people are not living intentionally anymore. They are reacting constantly, reacting to notifications, impulses, emotional stimulation, external noise. And reactive living destroys deep identity slowly. The strongest transformations happen when people finally reclaim their attention, reclaim their focus, their silence, their routines, their emotional presence. That intentionality changes identity completely. You cannot become powerful while your attention belongs to everything except your future. Impossible. Because distracted minds struggle to build disciplined lives. Most people wait too long to realize distraction replaced their life quietly. Replaced discipline with entertainment, focus with stimulation, ambition with passiveness, intentionality with emotional escape. And eventually, the mirror reflects years of unconscious consumption. The strongest people learn how to be alone with themselves again. Alone without noise, distraction, stimulation, emotional escape. Because silence rebuilds awareness, and awareness rebuilds identity. There is something emotionally freeing about finally protecting your attention again. Because now, you stop drifting unconsciously and begin living intentionally. Every day, you are either feeding distraction
or feeding focus. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. Most people think they are just wasting small amounts of time. But repeated distraction wastes identity too. Because what repeatedly controls your attention eventually controls your future. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind focus, intentionality, discipline, emotional clarity.
But distraction keeps delaying access to that identity. One day, you will either thank yourself for protecting your mind, or you will realize distraction slowly replaced the life you were supposed to build intentionally. Because distraction never stays harmless, it reshapes identity. There is one final truth in this chapter. Distraction is replacing your life quietly, replacing focus, discipline, ambition, emotional depth, intentional living. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to let distraction consume the person I still have the potential to become.
Chapter 7. The Person You Could Have Been. There is a version of you that almost existed. A version that stayed disciplined, protected their focus, kept going, refused distraction, refused comfort, became intentional. A version that could have changed their life, changed their future, changed their mindset, changed their family, changed everything. But somewhere along the way, you drifted. And now, that version feels distant. Let's slow this down. Most people do not become failures suddenly. They slowly move away from their potential. Through distraction, procrastination, emotional exhaustion, weak habits, comfort addiction, repeated self-betrayal. And eventually, they stop recognizing the gap between who they are and who they could have become. One of the heaviest emotional burdens is unrealized potential. The pain of knowing you were capable of more. More discipline, greatness, growth, consistency, intentional living. But repeated patterns kept interrupting transformation. There are people listening to this right now who secretly think about the version of themselves they abandoned. The version that wanted more from life, believed bigger things were possible, had stronger ambition, had clearer vision, fought harder internally. But life happened. Comfort happened. Distraction happened. And slowly, that future version faded emotionally. The person you could have been does not disappear instantly. That version fades quietly. Every time you procrastinate, avoid discomfort, waste time, abandon discipline, emotionally escape life, you move slightly further away from that identity. That repetition changes destiny. Most people think they still have unlimited time, but time means nothing without intentional behavior, because repeated unconscious living creates repeated unconscious future. There is something emotionally terrifying about waking up one day and realizing you became a smaller version of yourself. Smaller mentally, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. That realization creates grief internally. Most people are carrying invisible grief. Grief for wasted years, abandoned dreams, lost discipline, weakened ambition, the person they almost became.
And because that grief is invisible, nobody notices how heavy it feels internally. Every habit either moves you closer to your future self or moves you further away. That process never pauses. Every routine matters. The strongest people think long-term. They think, who am I becoming? What future am I building? What identity are my habits creating? Because intentional thinking creates intentional lives. Most people are not destroyed by lack of ability. They are destroyed by inconsistency, distraction, emotional escape, lack of intentionality. And repeated self-neglect slowly destroys potential. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please do not give up on me. Begging you to rebuild discipline, to stop wasting time,
To become intentional again. To protect your future. Because your future self still exists mentally. The strongest version of you was never impossible. That version required consistency, discipline, emotional maturity, intentional routines, repeated self-respect. But weak habits interrupted the process repeatedly. Most people underestimate how much emotional damage regret creates. Because regret changes confidence, emotional energy, self-respect, identity. And carrying regret for years becomes emotionally exhausting. There is something painful about knowing you had the potential to become extraordinary, but slowly settled into comfort instead. Comfort.
Weakened urgency, weakened discipline, weakened standards, weakened focus, and eventually, comfort reshaped identity. Most people are trying to escape regret emotionally through distraction, entertainment, emotional numbness, constant stimulation. But distraction never removes regret. It delays confrontation. The strongest people confront themselves honestly. Honestly enough to ask, what happened to me? Why did I stop fighting for my future? Why did I become comfortable with less? What version of myself am I abandoning? That honesty creates awakening. Most people slowly lower their standards. Not dramatically. Quietly. They slowly become comfortable, wasting time, lacking discipline, abandoning routines, emotionally escaping life, and eventually, weakness becomes identity. The person you could have been still exists as possibility, still waiting behind discipline, focus, intentionality, emotional strength. But every repeated distraction delays access to that identity.
The strongest people stop mourning potential and start rebuilding themselves intentionally. Because potential alone changes nothing. Execution changes identity. You cannot become powerful while continuously feeding weakness daily. Impossible. Because repeated behavior creates repeated identity. Most people want transformation emotionally. But transformation requires behavioral change. Real change in habits, routines, focus, standards, emotional responses. That repetition rebuilds identity slowly. There is something emotionally exhausting about pretending you are okay with becoming less than you were capable of becoming. Because deep down, most people know they were meant for more.
the strongest people stop normalizing mediocrity.
They stop saying, "This is enough. I'll change later. Maybe someday." Because delayed growth eventually becomes regret. Every disciplined action rebuilds your future self slightly. Every time you focus anyway, continue anyway, resist distraction anyway, protect your future anyway, you move closer to the person you could become. That repetition creates transformation. Most people wait too long to wake up mentally, too long to rebuild discipline, protect their future, confront weak habits, become intentional again. And eventually, years disappear inside unconscious living. The strongest transformations happen when people finally become tired of abandoning their potential, tired of wasting years, emotionally escaping, living distracted, becoming smaller versions of themselves. That frustration creates awakening. The person you could have been is watching your habits right now, watching what you tolerate, what you repeat, what you avoid, what you become emotionally attached to. Because your habits determine whether that future becomes reality. Most people think they need motivation to change. Not true. They need honesty. Honesty about
their habits, their distractions, their emotional patterns, their lack of intentionality. Because honesty interrupts unconscious living. The strongest people become obsessed with alignment. Alignment between goals, habits, routines, identity. Because aligned people build intentional futures. You are becoming someone daily, not someday, now. Through habits, focus, discipline, emotional responses, routines. That repetition creates the future version of you. There is something emotionally powerful about finally deciding, I refuse to keep abandoning the person I still have the potential to become. That decision changes identity. Because now, you stop drifting unconsciously and begin rebuilding intentionally. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, emotional maturity, focus, intentional living. But unconscious habits keep delaying access to that identity. Every day, you are either their habits, their distractions, their emotional patterns, their lack of intentionality. Because honesty interrupts unconscious living. The strongest people become obsessed with alignment. Alignment between goals, habits, routines, identity. Because aligned people build intentional futures. You are becoming someone daily, not someday, now. Through habits, focus, discipline, emotional responses, routines. That repetition creates the future version of you. There is something emotionally powerful about finally deciding, I refuse to keep abandoning the person I still have the potential to become. That decision changes identity. Because now, you stop drifting unconsciously and begin rebuilding intentionally. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, emotional maturity, focus, intentional living. but unconscious habits keep delaying access to that identity. Every day, you are either
moving closer to your future self or moving further away. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. Most people think they lost their potential completely. Not true. Most people simply stopped protecting it consistently, and repeated neglect created emotional distance from who they were capable of becoming. One day, you will either thank yourself for rebuilding intentionally, or you will realize you spent years slowly abandoning the person you could have become. Because potential does not disappear suddenly. It fades through repetition.
There is one final truth in this chapter. The person you could have been is still possible.
But possibility means nothing without discipline. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to keep becoming smaller than the life I know I am capable of building. Chapter 8. Rebuilding the person you lost. There comes a moment when you finally realize you cannot continue becoming this version of yourself. Not because you hate yourself, but because deep down you remember there was once more fire inside you, more discipline, ambition, clarity, emotional strength, belief, hunger for life. And somewhere along the way, you drifted away from that person. Let's slow this down. Most people do not notice the exact moment they lose themselves, because identity decay happens quietly through distraction, emotional exhaustion, comfort addiction, self-betrayal, repeated neglect, and eventually you wake up feeling disconnected from your own life. There is something emotionally painful about missing the old version of yourself, the version that dreamed bigger, tried harder, believed more deeply, wanted more from life, felt emotionally alive. But life happened. Disappointment happened. Comfort happened. And slowly, that version faded into memory. Most people secretly believe they are too far gone to rebuild themselves, too undisciplined, too distracted, too emotionally tired, too inconsistent. But that belief is part of the problem, because hopelessness creates passiveness. And passive people stop rebuilding themselves intentionally. The person you lost can still be rebuilt, not perfectly, but intentionally, through discipline, consistency, emotional honesty, repeated self-respect. That repetition restores identity slowly. The strongest transformations are not dramatic initially. They begin quietly. One disciplined morning, one intentional decision, one protected routine, one honest confrontation with yourself. That is how identity begins rebuilding. Most people are waiting to feel ready before they change, but readiness is often created through action, not before action. That means you rebuild yourself by moving, not by waiting emotionally. There are people listening to this right now who secretly feel emotionally disconnected from themselves. Disconnected from purpose, discipline, confidence, intentionality, emotional peace. And deep down,
They are exhausted from carrying that distance internally. You cannot hate yourself into transformation.
Real rebuilding requires honesty, discipline, patience, self-respect. Because healing identity is not about punishment. It is about alignment. Most people try to rebuild externally first, but real rebuilding starts internally. Internally through habits, routines, emotional patterns, standards, focus. That internal shift changes everything. There is something powerful about deciding, I am going to become someone I respect again. That decision changes identity immediately. Because now you stop drifting unconsciously and begin rebuilding intentionally. Most people underestimate how much self-respect changes emotional energy. When you keep promises to yourself, protect your routines, stay disciplined, continue anyway, your mind notices.
And slowly, self-trust begins returning. Every disciplined action rebuilds identity slightly. Every focused morning, completed routine, resisted distraction, intentional decision moves you closer to the person you want to become. That repetition creates transformation. The strongest people stop identifying with their lowest moments. They stop saying, "This is just who I am. I'll always struggle. I can never change." Because identity is not fixed. Identity evolves through repetition. Most people stay emotionally trapped because they keep rehearsing the same version of themselves daily. The same distractions, routines, emotional reactions, weak habits, and repeated behavior strengthens identity. The strongest people interrupt the pattern, not perfectly, consistently.
Because consistency matters more than emotional intensity. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, "Please rebuild us," begging you to stop wasting time, to stop emotionally escaping, to protect your future, to become intentional again. Because your future still depends on what you repeatedly practice. Most people are emotionally exhausted because they have been disconnected from themselves for too long. Disconnected from discipline, purpose, growth, emotional peace. And disconnection creates emptiness internally. The strongest version of you was never destroyed completely. That version became buried under distraction, emotional pain, weak habits, comfort addiction, repeated self-betrayal.
But buried is not the same as gone. There is something emotionally healing about becoming reliable to yourself again. Reliable enough to wake up intentionally, to protect your focus, to continue under pressure, to stop abandoning yourself. That reliability restores identity deeply. Most people think they need a completely new life to change. Not true. Sometimes they simply need stronger standards, intentional routines, emotional honesty, disciplined repetition. Because repetition rebuilds identity. The strongest people stop waiting for motivation, because motivation disappears, but standards remain. And standards protect discipline, focus, emotional stability, intentional living. That structure changes lives. You cannot continuously feed weakness, avoid discomfort, emotionally escape life.
and expect confidence to survive. Impossible. Because confidence requires self-respect.
And self-respect requires discipline. Most people are carrying shame internally. Shame for wasted years, abandoned goals, broken promises, weakened discipline. But shame alone changes nothing. Action changes identity. The strongest transformations happen when people finally become tired of disappointing themselves. Tired of restarting, procrastinating, abandoning routines, emotionally drifting through life. That frustration creates awakening. Every disciplined habit sends a message internally. We are changing. And over time, your mind begins believing in you again. That is how self-trust returns. Most people do not need perfection. They need momentum. Momentum built through routines, focus, discipline, consistency. That repetition rebuilds emotional strength slowly. Another layer. There is something emotionally freeing about finally admitting, I do not want to keep becoming this version of myself. That honesty creates transformation. Because now you become conscious of your direction again. The strongest people stop mourning the old version of themselves and start rebuilding intentionally instead. Because grief without action changes nothing. Every day, you are either rebuilding yourself or abandoning yourself. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. Most people wait too long to reclaim themselves, too long to rebuild routines, confront weak habits, protect their future, reconnect with discipline. And eventually, years disappear inside emotional drift. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, emotional maturity, intentionality, repeated self-respect. But unconscious living keeps delaying access to that identity. You are not rebuilding only discipline, focus, routines. You are rebuilding identity, self-trust, emotional strength, purpose. That process changes everything internally. One day, you will either thank yourself for rebuilding intentionally, or you will realize
You spent years mourning the person you lost while refusing to rebuild them. Because identity is not restored emotionally, it is restored behaviorally. There is one final truth in this chapter. Rebuilding the person you lost begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself daily through discipline, focus, intentionality, repeated self-respect. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to keep grieving the person I still have the power to become again. Chapter 9. Discipline restores identity. Most people think discipline is punishment. It isn't. Discipline is restoration. Restoration of focus, confidence, emotional stability, self-respect, identity. Because when your life becomes chaotic internally, discipline rebuilds structure, and structure rebuilds people. Let's slow this down. There are people listening to this right now who secretly feel disconnected from themselves, disconnected from purpose, ambition, consistency, emotional peace, intentional living. And deep down, they are exhausted from becoming someone they no longer recognize.
Most people do not lose themselves dramatically. They lose themselves through lack of discipline. Lack of discipline around habits, focus, emotions, routines, time, attention. And eventually, chaos becomes identity. Discipline is not only about productivity. Discipline is about alignment. Alignment between who you are and who you want to become. Because every disciplined action moves identity closer to alignment. There is something emotionally painful about living in constant conflict with yourself.
Wanting growth, peace, confidence, transformation, but repeatedly feeding distraction, comfort, emotional escape, weak habits. That contradiction destroys internal peace. Most people think discipline is restrictive, but discipline creates freedom. Freedom from emotional chaos, inconsistency, distraction, self-sabotage, regret. That freedom changes identity deeply. The strongest people become disciplined because they become tired of suffering unnecessarily. Tired of wasting years, abandoning routines, emotionally drifting through life, restarting constantly. That frustration creates awakening. Discipline restores self-trust slowly. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, wake up intentionally, stay focused, continue under pressure, your mind notices. And slowly, confidence begins returning. Most people are emotionally exhausted because they no longer trust themselves internally. They say, "I'll change. I'll start tomorrow. This time will be different." But repeated inconsistency weakens belief internally. And eventually, their own mind stops believing them. That is why discipline matters psychologically. Because discipline rebuilds credibility with yourself. And self-trust changes identity deeply. The strongest version of you requires structure, requires routines, focus, consistency, emotional control, intentional living. But weak habits destroy structure slowly. Most people are trying to heal emotionally without changing behavior. Impossible. Because repeated behavior creates repeated emotional states. That means if the habits stay the same, the identity stays the same too. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please become disciplined again. Begging you to stop wasting your life, to stop emotionally escaping, to rebuild routines, to protect your future. Because discipline restores direction. Most people wait for motivation before taking action. But disciplined people understand. Action creates motivation, not the other way around. That mindset changes everything. Every disciplined routine sends a message internally. We are rebuilding. That repetition creates confidence, emotional strength, momentum, self-respect. And over time, identity changes completely. Most people underestimate how much discipline affects emotional health. Because discipline creates clarity, structure, stability, intentionality. And intentional living creates peace internally. There is something emotionally powerful about becoming reliable to yourself again. Reliable enough to continue anyway.
to stay focused anyway, to protect your future anyway, to stop abandoning yourself emotionally. That reliability rebuilds identity deeply. Most people think discipline means perfection. Not true. Discipline means consistency. Consistency during low motivation, emotional exhaustion, difficult seasons, internal resistance.
That consistency changes identity. The strongest people stop negotiating with weakness constantly. They stop making excuses, emotionally escaping, protecting comfort, tolerating distraction. Because repeated weakness becomes personality. Discipline interrupts identity decay. Every time you resist distraction, protect your focus, continue under pressure, maintain routines, you weaken the chaotic version of yourself slightly. That repetition rebuilds emotional strength. Most people are not lacking potential, they are lacking structure. Structure around habits, time, attention, emotions, routines. And without structure, potential fades. The strongest transformations happen quietly. Quietly through repeated routines, disciplined mornings, intentional habits, emotional control.
That repetition rebuilds identity slowly. There is something emotionally exhausting about constantly restarting your life, restarting routines, goals, discipline, focus, because repeated inconsistency destroys momentum internally. Discipline protects momentum, and momentum protects identity.
That is why consistency matters more than intensity. Most people are trapped in emotional chaos because their habits are chaotic. Chaotic sleep, focus, routines, emotional responses, priorities. And chaotic habits create chaotic minds. The strongest people simplify their lives intentionally. They simplify distractions, routines, environments, priorities, because simplicity protects focus, and focus protects identity. Every act of discipline is an act of self-respect. Every time you wake up intentionally, continue anyway, focus deeply, protect your future, you send a message internally. I still care about who I become. That message changes identity deeply. Most people wait too long to rebuild discipline, too long to protect routines, confront weak habits, stop emotionally escaping, become intentional again. And eventually, years disappear inside disorder. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, consistency, emotional maturity, intentional living. But repeated self-neglect keeps delaying access to that identity. Most people think discipline is external, but discipline is deeply internal. It is emotional regulation, intentional behavior, repeated self-respect, alignment between goals and actions. That internal structure changes everything. You cannot continuously abandon yourself, waste time, feed distraction, avoid discomfort, and still expect confidence to survive. Impossible, because confidence requires evidence, and discipline creates evidence. The strongest people become obsessed with standards. Standards around focus, routines, emotional control, consistency, intentional living. Because standards determine identity. There is something emotionally healing about rebuilding your life one disciplined habit at a time, because now you stop drifting unconsciously and begin rebuilding intentionally. Every disciplined day rebuilds your future slightly. Every protected routine, focused hour, intentional decision, resisted distraction moves you closer to the person you want to become. That repetition creates transformation. Most people are waiting for life to change them, but disciplined people change themselves intentionally, and intentional people build intentional futures. Every day, you are either strengthening discipline or strengthening weakness. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. Most people think they lost themselves completely. Not true. Most people simply stopped practicing discipline consistently, and repeated chaos created emotional distance from who they were capable of becoming. One day, you will either thank yourself for rebuilding discipline early, or you will realize you spent years becoming emotionally exhausted because you refused to create structure inside your life. Because discipline does not destroy identity. It restores it. There is one final truth in this chapter. Discipline restores identity quietly, through consistency, routines, focus, emotional control, repeated self-respect. And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to keep feeding the version of myself that is destroying my future. Chapter 10. Become someone you respect again. At some point, the deepest form of pain is not failure. It is disappointment in yourself. The painful realization that you stopped trying fully. You stopped protecting your future. You stopped fighting for your potential. You became disconnected from the person you wanted to become. And eventually, you stopped respecting yourself deeply. Let's slow this down. There are people listening to this right now who secretly miss the feeling of being proud of themselves, proud of their discipline, their focus, their consistency, their ambition, their emotional strength. But years of distraction, emotional exhaustion, self-betrayal, comfort addiction changed that relationship internally. Self-respect is not built through words. It is built through behavior, through discipline, consistency, emotional honesty, intentional living. That repetition creates internal pride. Most people are waiting for confidence to appear first, but confidence follows evidence. Evidence that you can trust yourself, you can stay disciplined, you can protect your future, you can continue despite discomfort. That evidence creates self-respect. There is something emotionally painful about becoming someone you secretly do not admire anymore. Someone inconsistent, distracted, internal disappointment, emotionally reactive, passive, disconnected from purpose. That internal disappointment changes energy deeply. Most people are carrying silent frustration internally. Frustration from wasted potential, repeated procrastination, abandoned routines, emotional inconsistency. And over time, that frustration becomes emotional heaviness. You cannot continuously abandon yourself, waste your life, feed weak habits, emotionally escape reality, and still expect peace internally. Impossible.
Because your mind notices every act of self-betrayal, the strongest people become obsessed with integrity. Integrity between words, habits, standards, actions. Because aligned people respect themselves deeply. Most people think self-respect comes from external success. Not true. Some successful people secretly hate themselves internally. Because self-respect comes from discipline, honesty, consistency, intentional living. That internal alignment changes identity. There are people listening to this right now who remember a version of themselves that felt stronger internally, stronger mentally, emotionally, spiritually. But somewhere along the way, they stopped protecting that identity. Every broken promise weakens self-respect slightly. Every delayed goal, abandoned routine, emotional escape, wasted opportunity sends a message internally. We cannot trust ourselves. That repetition destroys confidence quietly. That is why discipline matters emotionally. Because discipline rebuilds credibility with yourself, and credibility restores identity. The strongest people become intentional about how they spend time, what habits they repeat, what environments influence them, what standards they tolerate. Because intentional living creates internal peace. Most people are not emotionally weak permanently. They simply lost alignment with themselves. Alignment with purpose, discipline, intentionality, self-respect. And disconnection creates emotional emptiness. There is something emotionally healing about finally becoming someone you can look at with pride again. Not because you became perfect, but because you stopped betraying yourself daily. Most people underestimate how deeply habits affect identity. Every repeated behavior says, "This is who we are." That means every disciplined action rebuilds self-respect slightly. The strongest version of you requires standards. Standards around focus, routines, emotional control, discipline, consistency. Because standards protect identity. Most people think they need massive transformation overnight. Not true. Sometimes transformation begins with waking up earlier, protecting focus, stopping emotional escaping, rebuilding routines, becoming intentional daily. That repetition changes everything. Every act of discipline sends a message internally. We still care about our future. That message restores emotional strength slowly. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please become someone we can respect again. Begging you to stop wasting time, to stop abandoning discipline, to stop emotionally escaping life, to rebuild your identity intentionally. Because your future depends on what you repeatedly practice. Most people are emotionally exhausted because they no longer feel proud of themselves internally. Not because they lack ability, but because they lost integrity with themselves. And internal misalignment destroys peace deeply. The strongest transformations happen when people finally become tired of disappointing themselves, tired of restarting, procrastinating, abandoning goals, becoming weaker versions of themselves. That frustration creates awakening. Self-respect changes behavior automatically.
When you genuinely respect yourself, you stop feeding distraction, tolerating weak habits, wasting time, emotionally escaping life. Because now you value your future differently. Most people are searching for motivation externally, but motivation becomes unstable without identity change internally. That is why standards matter more than feelings. You cannot become powerful while continuously rehearsing weakness daily. Impossible, because repeated behavior creates repeated identity. The strongest people become disciplined privately, when nobody is watching, nobody is praising them, nobody is rewarding them, because real identity is built in silence. Most people are trying to feel better emotionally without changing routines, habits, standards, discipline. But emotional peace follows alignment, and alignment requires intentional behavior. Every disciplined day rebuilds self-respect slightly. Every focused hour, intentional routine, resisted distraction, completed promise moves you closer to becoming someone you admire again. That repetition creates emotional healing. There is something emotionally powerful about finally looking at yourself and thinking, I am becoming stronger again. That feeling changes everything internally. Most people wait too long to rebuild their identity, too long to protect their future, rebuild discipline, stop emotionally escaping, become intentional again. And eventually, years disappear inside unconscious living. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, emotional maturity, intentional habits, repeated self-respect. But weak patterns keep delaying access to that identity. Most people think they lost themselves completely. Not true. Most people simply stopped respecting themselves consistently, and repeated self-betrayal created emotional distance from who they were capable of becoming. Every day, you are either building self-respect or destroying self-respect. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. The strongest people stop asking, how do I feel today? And begin asking, what kind of person am I becoming through these behaviors? That mindset changes destiny. There is something emotionally freeing about finally deciding, I refuse to keep becoming someone I secretly pity. That honesty creates transformation, because now you stop drifting emotionally and begin rebuilding intentionally. One day, you will either thank yourself for rebuilding your standards, or you will realize you spent years becoming someone you no longer respected internally. Because identity does not collapse suddenly. It collapses through repeated self-betrayal. There is one final truth in this chapter. You become someone you respect again through discipline, intentionality, consistency, emotional honesty, repeated self-respect.
And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, I refuse to keep becoming someone I no longer admire when I look in the mirror.
The mirror never lies. One day, you will stand in front of a mirror, and you will see more than your face. You will see your habits, your discipline, your standards, your emotional patterns, your repeated choices. The person you became through repetition.
Because the mirror never lies. It always reveals who you have been becoming quietly. Let's slow this down one final time. There are people listening to this right now who feel emotionally disconnected from themselves. Not because they are broken, but because somewhere along the way, they stopped protecting their focus, their discipline,
Their peace, their ambition, their future. And slowly, the person in the mirror began changing. Most people never notice identity decay while it's happening, because it happens quietly through distraction, emotional escape, procrastination, comfort addiction, repeated self-betrayal, and eventually, years disappear. The terrifying thing about unconscious living is that you can slowly become someone you never intended to become. Someone emotionally tired, passive,
Distracted, disconnected, comfortable with less. And by the time you notice, you barely recognize yourself internally anymore. This audiobook was never only about discipline, habits, focus, routines. It was about identity, about becoming conscious of who you are becoming daily. Because whether you realize it or not, your life is shaping you every single day. Every habit changes you slightly.
Every distraction changes you slightly. Every repeated behavior reshapes identity slightly. That process never pauses. Most people spend years trying to change outcomes, but outcomes follow identity, and identity follows repetition. That is why repeated behavior matters more than temporary motivation. There are people listening to this right now who secretly miss themselves, miss their ambition,
their discipline, their emotional strength, their belief in life, their hunger for growth. But deep down, they know that version was not destroyed completely, only buried. Buried under comfort, distraction, emotional exhaustion, self-neglect. The strongest version of you still exists, still waiting behind discipline, intentionality, emotional honesty, repeated self-respect. But weak habits keep delaying access to that identity. Most people think transformation happens dramatically. Not true. Transformation happens quietly. Quietly through routines, standards, focus, emotional control, consistency. That repetition rebuilds identity slowly. Every disciplined action matters. Every focused hour, protected routine, resisted distraction, intentional decision moves you slightly closer to the person you want to become. That repetition changes destiny. There is something emotionally exhausting about secretly knowing you are capable of more while continuously becoming less. Less disciplined, focused, intentional, emotionally strong. That internal conflict destroys peace deeply. Most people are not trapped permanently. They are trapped inside repeated patterns. Patterns of distraction, emotional escape, procrastination, weak habits, self-betrayal, and repeated patterns become identity. The strongest people interrupt the pattern. Not perfectly. Intentionally. Because intentional living changes identity completely. There are moments where your future self is begging you internally, please wake up. Begging you to rebuild discipline, to protect your future, to stop emotionally escaping life, to become intentional again. Because your future depends on what you repeatedly practice. Most people think they need motivation to change, but motivation fades. Standards remain. And standards protect discipline, focus, emotional stability, intentional living. That structure changes lives. You cannot continuously abandon yourself, waste your potential, emotionally escape life, feed weakness daily, and still expect peace internally. Impossible. Because your mind notices every repeated act of self-betrayal. That is why the mirror becomes painful eventually. Because eventually, you stop seeing who you wanted to become and start seeing what your habits created instead. The strongest transformations happen when people finally become tired of disappointing themselves, tired of restarting, procrastinating, drifting emotionally, wasting years becoming smaller versions of themselves. That frustration creates awakening. There is something emotionally powerful about finally deciding, I refuse to keep becoming someone I no longer recognize. That decision changes identity immediately, because now you stop drifting unconsciously and begin rebuilding intentionally. Most people are searching for confidence externally, but confidence is built internally, built through discipline, consistency, emotional honesty, repeated self-respect. That repetition restores self-trust slowly. Every day, you are either becoming stronger or becoming weaker, becoming intentional or becoming distracted, becoming disciplined or becoming emotionally passive. That process never pauses. Every habit matters. The strongest people become protective of their attention, their routines, their emotional peace, their future. Because intentional people understand identity is fragile without discipline. Most people wait too long to wake up mentally, too long to rebuild themselves, protect their future, confront weak habits, become intentional again. And eventually, time exposes the consequences of unconscious living. You still have time to rebuild yourself. Still time to rebuild discipline, to protect your focus, to reconnect with your purpose, to become someone you respect again. But transformation requires action, not wishing, not waiting. Action. The strongest people eventually realize the real battle was never only external. The real battle was distraction, comfort addiction, emotional escape, self-betrayal, unconscious living. And the moment they confronted those patterns honestly, everything began changing internally. One day, you will meet the person your habits created, the version built through discipline or distraction, intentionality or emotional escape, self-respect or self-neglect. And that meeting will reveal everything. The mirror never lies. It reveals what you practiced, what you tolerated, what you repeated, what you became emotionally attached to. Because repeated behavior always shapes identity, eventually. Most people think they lost themselves permanently. Not true. Most people simply stopped choosing themselves consistently, and repeated self-neglect created emotional distance from who they were capable of becoming. The strongest version of you is still possible, still waiting behind discipline, emotional maturity, intentional living, repeated self-respect.
But your future depends on the standards you practice from this moment forward. You do not become someone different overnight. You become someone different through repeated habits, repeated choices, repeated standards, repeated discipline. That repetition creates identity. One day, you will either thank yourself for rebuilding intentionally, or you will realize you spent years slowly becoming someone you never intended to become. Because identity does not collapse suddenly. It changes quietly. There is one final truth in this audiobook. The mirror was never your enemy. The mirror was revealing your patterns.
And the people who ultimately reclaim themselves are usually the people who finally decided, no matter how uncomfortable transformation becomes, I refuse to keep becoming someone I no longer recognize.